pass this on to Stuart.
Okay, great, Lindsay. Thank you. Give me a green check that you can hear me. Okay, at least some of you can. That's enough. Thank you. Great to be here. Nice to be talking. It's an interesting topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time on it with you all. Let me give you a little bit of preliminary stuff about what we're going to do here. First of all, I'll say a word about who we are. Then I am not going to go over what a board is, how a board operates, except in little bits. That was done in a previous webinar. I will present some challenges. These are things we've seen. These are the problems that folks have with boards, and talk a little bit about some ideas about how to resolve them. And a lot of it, though, is what I'm looking to hear from you all about, problems that you've all seen and you'd like to get some chat about. And so I'll be looking for your input in this thing. So first of all, Vermont Community Foundation, we're one of 700-some community foundations in the United States. We represent the state of Vermont. A community foundation, as some of you will know, it's not quite like a private foundation, like the Ford Foundation of Carnegie. It's a collection of funds. It's a network of people who put money together to try to accomplish things. And so in our case, we have almost 600 different funds, all with a slightly different purpose, primarily serving interests in Vermont and nearby Vermont. So they may be scholarship funds or funds serving environmental interests in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, or anything else. We do a combination of grants work and helping donors get money where they want it to go. And that's what community foundations around the country do. So with that having been said, let me jump right into this. A little context first. My background, I've been involved with boards since even before 1986, but my first executive director job, as I say there, was in 1986 for a statewide organization in Maryland. I've been a staff member for boards that are national, that are local, that are statewide, and as a board member, boards of all different stages, the ad hoc boards where we're trying to figure out what we're doing and let's just get a group of people together to figure something out, usually leading to an organization. The startups where we are leading into creating an organization, and then more mature boards. I'll also say boards that have been functional and dysfunctional, like most of us, and I've served in a variety of roles. At the Vermont Community Foundation, we actually work under a policy governance model. Some of you may know that John and Miriam Carver, in the early 80s created this model, which is a slightly different way of operating. I won't get into details on that, but it's an effort to keep boards at a very high level. And I know there are some people on the call who are familiar with policy governance, and if we want to get into that, we can, but I won't spend a lot of time on it today. So what should a board do? Well, at core, my view is there are really four primary functions of a board. There are a lot of things that flow out of that, but there are four primary functions of a board: hiring and firing key staff, providing overall organizational direction, representing the membership, and this is something particularly in policy governance, and I know I said I wouldn't talk much about that, but I'll say a few words, particularly in policy governance where the board is considered a direct link to the membership, and in our case to the citizens of the state of Vermont. They are representing those people in our organization, and their voice is critical. But broadly speaking, the board should represent the membership, and if it's not a membership, the people you're serving. That's what you need folks for, and if you think about that, that's where the board is often most helpful, because they have voices you don't always see as a staff person. And then fiscal oversight, including resource development, and depending on your board, it plays out in different ways. That becomes a very critical part, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of challenges on boards. But as I say, sometimes there are other responsibilities depending on the organizational model, and this is really important. Nobody always gets it right. No board is ever always right. And if you put yourself in a position where you say, I need to have a perfect board, you're going to forever be frustrated, because it's never going to be quite right. And in fact, if you think you have a perfect board, I can guarantee that the problems are going to start coming, because like an organization, you're never in stasis, and if you are, that's going to be problematic. We always need to grow. We always need to be looking to the future. And the moment you have a perfect board, somebody's going to turn out and things are going to change again. And of course, boards can create headaches, frustration, tears. There are things that boards do that drive us as staff members crazy sometimes, and that's what we're going to talk about. Again, all of it is not to say board members are bad because they're not to say boards are bad because they're not, but as staff working with board, we have a constant effort to try to make our organization work most effectively, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, board problems, some solutions, or at least some ideas about how to address some of the problems that we see on a board. Now, I think there is an overview point that there are certain functions that are the most critical. I talked about the functions that are most critical, but I think there are certain questions that are the core questions for your board before we start to look at some of the challenges. And they are these. Does your board have clarity about their role? We're going to talk about problems that are coming up and over time, and over again, it's going to be related to the board not having clarity about what their role is, what is their job in relation to your job as a staff member. Does the board have clarity about your role? And no matter where you are in an organizational life cycle, whether you're a startup with a largely volunteer board, a board doing the volunteer work for the organization, or whether you're in a mature organization, if you don't have clarity about job description, get V to a committee to create a job description for the board and get the board to agree with it, and a lot of the problems are going to at least be reduced. They're not going to go away because sometimes things don't work out well, in part because sometimes you just don't have the right people on the board. So, does the board have clarity about their role? Does the board have clarity about your role? And do you have the right people on the board? So, board headaches. Let's jump into some of these. Both in my experience and as we look at work with organizations around the state, most of these come straight out of stories we've heard. The first one, they try to do the job of the staff. This is typically a challenge that many of you will see when you move from an organization that was a volunteer-run organization into a staffed organization. So they may try to get involved in the personnel decisions. Boards will say, no, I don't want you to hire that person. I know a recent example, professional staff had just came to the board to announce this is who we want to hire, and the board spent an hour talking about whether or not that was the right person to hire. The day-to-day work of the director or directing volunteers, board members coming into the office and telling volunteers what they should be doing, looking over the shoulder of the director, giving direction to other staff. Some of the stories we hear are very frustrating for organizations. So that is, I think this is maybe one of the most commonly heard complaints is, hey, this is my job and the board won't leave me alone. So what do you do about that? Well, first thing I would say is, what stage of the board are you in? Are you in a volunteer board? Are you in this transition? And oftentimes that's what you get. And one of the key answers, I talked about this earlier, is having the job description discussion. Having somebody come in and talk with the board and help the board understand that there are different stages in boards and that what they were doing was great at that stage of the organizational life. But you know what? We're now at a different place. And oftentimes an outsider, a board member, and I was talking to somebody yesterday who is having this problem, and she got the director and board chair of another similar organization to come in and talk with her board, and it made a huge difference because it allowed her board to better understand that, okay, we need to go back to the right functions for our stage of life. And then that last point there is getting the right board members. One of the great frustrations in this state, and I know there are people not in Vermont, but oftentimes in rural areas, is we're all chasing the same board members, and you're trying to find board members who have experience being a board member. And I think it's one of the deficits in this state is enough training for board members on how to be the board member. Because if you get somebody into your organization who has never been on a board, they're going to bring in their expectations, their understandings of business, of church, of whatever it is, and that may not work on your organization. So You're not always going to get those people right off the bat, but if you don't have people who are familiar with boards, you need to have a serious training program with your organization, an orientation where old-timers help newcomers understand how this board functions. Creating a mentoring program is often a very good way to do that too. You assign a long-timer to a new person to help them understand the culture of the organization. Very important. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one here, which is won't raise money. I'm sure.
Stuart?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yes.
Stuart, just this is Karen. Before you move on, we had somebody type in the chat box saying that.
Yeah.
Let me find it. That Karen has a total volunteer board. It's the Vermont School Counselor Association. So just wanted to make sure that if there were questions that she had, you did address sort of volunteer for professional. Just wanted to make a note of that.
Oh, that's great. And actually, then I would imagine that partly is because I was not being clear. When I say volunteer, nonprofit boards are all volunteer. Everybody's always got volunteer boards. Now, it may be some people are in their positions and their employer pays them while they're doing the board service. But I'm imagining that in a nonprofit world, they're all about volunteer boards. When I was talking about volunteer boards earlier, I was talking about boards that play the role as volunteer coordinators for the organizations, who are doing the staff work for the organization. And I see that Karen's saying, there are no paid positions. So that is a particular kind of board, and the clarity on job description is going to be particularly important in that role as well, so that because everybody's going to be vying to do something or vying not to do something. But you need that clarity about each function on the board. Your job is to do X, your job is to do Y, your job is to do Z. And you're also going to need, in that case, a particularly strong board chair to help manage the people volunteering for different functions. I don't talk a lot about the board chair in this discussion, but it becomes a really important function. The board chair facilitating people understanding their role. If you think about your own volunteer activities, the volunteer activities you like are the ones where you know exactly what it is people need you to do. When I think about joining a board, I want people to tell me, hey, these are the things I need you for, and up front. And so clarity on the responsibilities, whether as a board volunteer or others, is going to be important. We may come back to this, but let me go through a few other things here first, and then if we want to get into it again, we'll talk about that. So the won't raise money question is an ongoing question, and I would say for starters, for organizations that are looking for fundraising, first of all, say it from the beginning. Very often I hear board members who say, I got on the board and they never said anything about fundraising, and then suddenly they want me to raise a whole lot of money. That's not what I signed up for. So say it from the beginning. Be very clear, be explicit. You may lose some people who you wanted to have on the board, but it's better not to have people who are going to be frustrated later, because it's going to create a culture of frustration, and you don't want to do that. Second, identify a few key allies on the board. If you have a few people who really get it, have them provide the leadership on fundraising. That they're going to listen to those people. On my first board, I had two people who led the charge on fundraising, and in the end, this goes to expectations, they were the two main fundraisers I had. However, because they provided leadership, they were able to convince most of the rest of the board to play a modest role. I don't think on most boards, my experience is, that you ever have everybody fully engaged in fundraising. It's just such a rare thing to happen. But everybody can play a modest role, and if you have a few key allies and a few leaders on your board, that's where it's going to be most effective. Fundraising, be very clear about it from the beginning. Identify your allies. Create clear expectations for yourself and for the board going forward, because not everybody's going to do it, but you're going to have some key leaders on fundraising. And the other thing you may find is that you may be going from a non-fundraising board to a fundraising board, and you need to allow the board to have a full process on that, for the board to discuss it, because if the board buys into the change, then you're going to be have a better chance. And I see somebody just posted the idea, the maxim for board members is give, get, or get off. It's a very common thing, and I think it's not a bad idea at all if you've got that. And depending on your organization, you may have an organization where you say, look, we don't expect you to give a lot, but give what matters to you. And if you can't give, go out and find some other people. And I think creating the range of give, get, or get off is a very appropriate thing to do. Okay, next item that we hear, the evaluation of the director is unrelated to the work of the organization. I won't spend a lot of time on this, though. If anybody's got examples, feel free to share them. Again, something we see oftentimes when an organization is struggling in one way or another. The expectations are not clear. The same person I was talking to yesterday about her board had her annual review about 2 months ago, and the board had been pushing her all year to raise money, raise money, raise money, raise money. And she'd been doing that, and actually they ended up with a surplus in it's an arts organization, a very difficult situation. They ended up with a surplus. This is a large organization in another state. And in her review, the board spent most of their time talking about how she was not providing staff leadership. They didn't talk at all about fundraising, even though the whole year had been spent telling her, don't do anything else, raise money this year. So what's the job description of the board? What are the job description for the staff? And if you're the staff, make sure that your annual review includes expectations for the coming year and refer back to them. One of the things I do is I have an annual letter that I submit to the board saying this is what you should judge me on in the coming year. A lot of you will do things like that. When we do my review at the end of the year, the board says, what did you say you were going to do? What did we agree that you said you were going to do? Put it in writing. It's like any kind of employee review. Be clear up front, and it's a lot easier at the other end. And also, the close relationship with the chair is going to matter a lot in that one. Yeah, I see somebody else's point. Amazed at the number of boards that don't feel comfortable expecting 100% board donation. I agree with that. I think every board, certainly something foundations look for. We're looking for a commitment to the organization. Every board should have some level of contribution from everybody, and I'm surprised that we don't have it, and it should be easier. Next board headache that I'm imagining some of you might not view so much as a headache. Ignoring the finances. I talked at the very beginning about key questions for the board, but this is it's one of the greatest, most important things that a board can do. There is greater scrutiny than ever. The problems you hear, read something like Nonprofit Quarterly, and they tell stories, they report stories all the time of boards that were just asleep at the wheel around financial problems. And find the resources, the Boardsource or the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and teach the board some key questions for your organization. The Nonprofit Finance Fund does a nice job with some materials that say, here are 5-10 questions that you can ask. Tell your board, give your board that list of 5 or 10 questions and say, look, ask one question from this list every time we get together to talk about the finances. Or create your own list. Here are the 8 key indicators for our organization's financial success. Make sure you understand them, and I expect to be asked questions about them. This is, I put it as a problem with boards, largely because I think boards don't pay enough attention. You usually have 1 or 2 people, and that's okay. 1 or 2 people who pay attention, but make sure you have the people paying attention to the finances and put a little time into understanding them yourself. All right. Where are they? They don't show up. I've been involved with boards where attendance at board meetings was an iffy thing. As a result, the culture of the organization was a little haphazard. It wasn't quite clear who was engaged with the organization. And it made it hard for the organization to thrive. So what do you do about that? Well, first of all, you want to have clear expectations. Clear expectations up front. We expect you to attend a certain number of meetings, and if you don't, we're probably going to have to ask you to leave. Organization, actually a somewhat humorous story, I guess. Organization I was involved with on staff for previously. They had a board member, it's a national organization, one of their board members was not attending meetings, great guy, but just couldn't get there. So the president at the time flew out to Chicago to meet with him and told Barack Obama he could no longer be on the board of directors. I'm not sure that that was a great choice, but that's the hard decision you have to make when you're getting involved with that. And so here's what I say. Is your organization number 1 or number 2 on someone's list? And if it's not, then you need to think seriously about whether you want them. Now, you could say number 3, you could say number 4, but here's the thing. There was a guy I worked with a lot in New Hampshire who would talk about board service and proudly say he was on 16 boards of directors. Well, I said to him, what? So what does number 14 get from you other than your name? And your name may be really good, but what do they get from you in terms of service? And is it worthwhile? And if you are not getting board members who say, yes, this is my primary organization or my secondary organization, you have to think about what amount of attention you're going to get from them. My experience is people who are very experienced with boards understand this, understand that it's 1 or 2 on their list. And frequently we'll talk to people about joining our board and they'll say, well, I'm on 2 boards now, I'll be leaving this board in a year or 2 years, and then let's talk again. And I think that is a critical thing. Nice comment here from Mary Peabody. First retreat, the expectation was that this board will be your first priority after your family or profession. Entirely appropriate thing to ask of people, and I think you should always ask, are we, what else are you involved with? And how committed are you? If not, this is one of those things where you're going to go back to that question that I showed before. Where are they? They don't simply show up. Is the organization number 1 or is it number 2? And the other thing this has to do with is, do you have a governance committee? Is there a governance committee? Is there a governance committee that's helping the board understand what they're doing? Okay. Irrelevance and distraction. This goes to job description. The board that says, what color are the napkins at the annual event? The board that says, is it starting at 2 or is it starting at 2:30? The board that says, gets involved with wallpapering the office. This is, again, something that will come out of organizations, usually in the earlier stages where you don't have staff. And it can be appropriate, but even then you want to assign it to a committee. But it's something that we certainly hear about and can cause great frustration. Next one, absent for the tough problems. This is one we see a lot. It's the board that is not present when, for instance, an executive director is melting down, or when the finances are going down the hole. There's a story out of from a national organization about a year ago, based in Virginia, where the board president was having problems. The board president continued to be paid while not working. The board itself was friends of the board president and didn't really want to push this person and make them do something else about it. And this is a tougher one. If you don't have a board that's really willing to get engaged, it's not real easy to know how you're going to resolve this problem. As a staff member, though, I think the place to start is, first of all, you start with your board chair and talk about serious concerns with your board chair about where the organization is going. Malfeasance, if there are serious things, you want to have a process to complain to the board or file a complaint. But you need to be able to talk to the board chair about what kind of process you're going to put in place to resolve this problem. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to be willing to do. If your board chair isn't willing to engage in it, do you have a governance committee that you can work with that's going to talk to the board about different ways of behaving, about taking responsibilities seriously? In the end, I've said to some people, in the end, if your board just absolutely refuses to participate in making the tough decisions, whether it's about a president, executive director who's not doing well, you as a staff person may have to at some point decide, I can no longer function here, and I think you have to be willing to do that. But it involves getting the board, it may involve getting new board members, it involves finding the allies on the board who are willing to address these problems. All right, this is how we do it in my business, or if we were a business, this is what we would do. There have been a lot of articles written about this question in the Harvard Business Review and elsewhere, and business people who find themselves very involved with nonprofits frequently will come back and say, I thought I knew everything, and then I started serving on nonprofit boards and I realized my models don't necessarily work. Organization I was talking with not long ago, they had a huge problem with their new business people on the board who were not experienced nonprofit board members, and all they knew was how to analyze the financials from the kind of profit loss model. The board members did not understand that in this particular organization their business model included tuition that was coming in, and so there were a lot of ups and downs in the finances, and as a result caused tremendous rift between the board and the staff, and it had to be resolved through getting new board members who understood how the organization works. Now, there are a lot of really useful people from business, great business people. There are a lot of business practices that are helpful, but it can be a problem if the expectations are not set clearly. You need to talk about the goals of the organization, you need to clarify responsibilities in the job description of the board, and you need to talk about what the board expects from the staff. I see a question about fundraising. We'll come back to fundraising. We talked a little bit about it, but we'll come back again. Just do a couple more of these because then I want to open it up more for your questions. Staffing the board becomes a full-time job. Again, this is, many of you may have been in this position where you spend, especially if you've got something like a monthly meeting, you spend all your time with either committees or creating interesting agendas for the board meeting. Again, I talk about this over and over. You got to go back to reviewing the goals of the organization, clarifying responsibilities, and clarifying what the board expects. And it's tricky to slip, if you've had a culture where you're constantly creating really cool and exciting meetings for the board, and the board expects that, it's tricky to move into a place where those meetings are organized more for the benefit of the organization. But it's something that you need to work on, and again, sit with a governance committee. There are a lot of good models for effective board meetings, and there's some resources at the end, but look at the effective models for board agendas, and that can be a way to get to it. So those are some that I have, and what I want to do is hear you all and what you'd like to hear. So go crazy with the box. I'm going to start with the first one that's in there. You can ask questions about anything that I started with, but also put yours in. The first one is boards and fundraising. Should all board members fundraise, and at what level of activity? So actually, let me ask the group. Do the green or green check or the red X. Should every member of the board fundraise? So respond to that. I'm just interested in what we hear from folks. We'll pause a minute as we look. People are muted and rushing back to the computer to answer. So far, it's all greens. Oh no, there are a handful of reds down there. Look at that. Yeah. So so you can see, the questioner can see. I think it's something that you have to look at based on your particular board and your particular mission. There are many boards where fundraising is going to be essential. And there are other boards where, as Mr. Seitz here says, it's an advisory board only. So that's not a fundraising board typically, although even in that case, you may have situations where you're asking that board to provide, see if they'll make their own contribution. I talked a little bit about this earlier, and you just need to be clear about it up front and decide what kind of an organization you are. So for instance, if you're the Humane Society, my guess is every Humane Society board member has to raise money almost no matter where you are. If you're an academic institution or a think tank, you may not have academic institutions, I guess it's all about fundraising, but a think tank, you may not have obligations for fundraising on those, and that may be entirely appropriate. Again, I would say, what is the appropriate function of your board? Then that becomes the answer. But having said it, clarity up front, a board committee working on it, and if you can't function without extra support from the community in that way, you just say it and you just move forward and find the board members will do it. Okay, nice question from Mary Peabody. What are you doing? The board president is so averse to conflict that serious subjects never make it to the table or get passed over. Well, I think that, excuse me, one of the things I would think about in that case is, do you have an executive committee or a governance committee that can, for instance, create a set of major, let's say, here are the major topics for our organization going forward, and create an agenda, a series of agendas over time that move toward those more difficult discussions. I don't think it changes anything if in the moment somebody has a conflict and the board chair won't address it, but you may be able to structure discussions with pros and cons and that kind of thing that would allow those discussions to happen. You know, in the end, maybe some of the discussions happen in a committee rather than at the full board level. So finding a structural way, I think oftentimes if you can structure these discussions, structure a way to deal with the difficult topics, you can get to them when, if they pop up in the moment, you won't get there. I'd be interested in responses to that. Let's see, next one. I serve on a board that's been operating as a volunteer board. I think we could benefit from a staff position. Where would we get info on what services we could expect and what they might cost? Great question. Well, I would start with probably in Vermont, Common Good VT, the website, and one, I would look and see what materials they already have there, but also you may find that there's a place to post questions. What you want to do is you want to ask people who've done it how it worked for them, and I would go on there, and there are a lot of resources there. In terms of costs, there are salary surveys, there are, but I would want to know both costs and what resources you might have that you can have accessible. I'm going to move on. ED for 20 years and never had a formal review. Oh my gosh, yeah, this is a common one. I think absolutely you want to push for this. And I think it's not only about you, it's about the organization and the organization's seriousness about where it is heading. I think your story, Karen, is extremely common, that boards don't like to do reviews. I would say the majority of organizations I've worked for did reviews spottily. I insisted upon it here. I don't think that my predecessor had a review for a number of years, but I insisted upon it because I want to make sure that the board in a deep way knows where I'm taking the organization and that they're supportive of it. And I think it's going to make you better, and I think it's going to make the board take the organization more seriously. I think it's very easy for the organization to say, yeah, it all sounds good to me, and this way I don't have to engage. One of the problems is, frequently I think, when people have been in an organization for a long time, the board has always said everything's good, everything's good, everything's good. And when a problem does come up, that's the board that can't deal with the problem. So I would do, in terms of what's the official thing, for what it's worth, what I do is I write what I call a futures letter. Every year I write a letter saying, here's what about a page, here's what we've done in the past year, and here's where we succeeded, and here's where we failed. Here are the challenges going forward, and here's how we're going to focus our resources for the coming year. It opens up a discussion. And the board is able to ask me about my vision for the next year, my long-term vision, why we didn't succeed on one thing or another. And I think that having that kind of discussion is only to the good. Shouldn't there be a fundraising committee with a certain fraction of the board, and how many people? I think a fundraising committee is a very good idea. If the fundraising committee can get very focused, it partly depends on size of the organization and goals, but the challenge I have seen with fundraising committees is that if you don't have the right people on them, they can be more trouble than they're worth. And so you need to make sure that you have people who get fundraising and are willing to commit to fundraising, and they understand the fundraising you are doing in your organization. If you're primarily a major gifts fundraising organization, visits with individuals fundraising, make sure you get people who have some comfort level with that, understand how that works, or are willing to learn and interested in doing that. In terms of how many people it can be, committees fewer than 3 are not terribly helpful. I think that's too small. Depending on your board size, 5 people, is it more than that? I think 5 is probably a pretty good number for a committee like that. It also depends on what you're asking them to do. Is this the committee that's coordinating every aspect of your fundraising dinner, or is this a committee that is looking at names and assigning names to different board members of people to talk to? So I don't think there's ever one answer. I wouldn't make it too big because it's hard for committees too big to function. I also would put on my fundraising committee and have not just board members but some other people, because there are always going to be people who are really good and interested in fundraising who aren't going to be on the board, and that can make that committee that much stronger. Okay, Vicki, what's the best method to transfer guidance when a staff person retires that had the responsibility of the advisory board on their plate and must now be assumed by another staff person temporarily and permanently? Well, what's the best method to do that? I have a couple thoughts on this. One, it's always nice to have a transition time where somebody is sitting with the person over a period of time, introduce the new person to that advisory board over time, and I think that's probably best. I think sometimes we have to also recognize that people can be really good on their own, and if you throw somebody into being a leader of a committee or a leader of an organization, oftentimes people can do a lot more than we think they can, and we can overstate the value of a previous person. And I say that for me too. When I leave, other people can fill my shoes. But I think best would be to introduce the new person over some period of time. Have them serve as a number two. If you're able to say, hey, I still am going to be leaving this organization, and I'm introducing Vicki to you. She's going to be sitting with us because she'll be staffing this committee after a period of time. So having that kind of gentle transition can be a good one. Email response between major face-to-face executive board meetings, statewide social studies teacher group. So so email response between major face. So maybe Mike, you can clarify this. Are you talking about, and we'll come back to it after you get back up, are you talking about people going back and forth randomly about whatever, or are you talking about official meetings, email type meetings? If you could say that, then we'll come back to that question. I'm going to move on to Mark while we wait for Mike's. How do you get an advisory board to be more actively involved in advocacy for the organization within the community and in communicating needs and comments from the community with the staff and director? Well, one is having the right kinds of people on your advisory board. For starters, if you don't have people on your advisory board who understand advocacy or believe in advocacy, you need to find new ones. Two, within the organization, having the clear discussion at the staff and board level that this is something you really believe in and that this is a core activity for the organization. And three, in terms of getting needs and comments from the community, listening sessions, Zoom surveys, there are the email surveys of members or people you're connected with. I think if you have listening sessions in the community for your constituency, I think those can be useful models. But I also think combine the in-face feedback with the email surveys and things with certain members, certain people. I think you're not going to get statistically valid stuff from those surveys, from the Zoomerang and whatnot, but you can get really incredibly useful information. And I think a combination of the two can be really helpful. But again, to start with, do you have the right people on your advisory committee who are ready to be involved in advocacy? And two, are you clear at the board and staff level that is something you want to do? Optimal size of the board. Rule of thumb on optimal size. I don't know that there's an optimal size. My current board is 12. I think it's a little small for my tastes, but I've seen really good boards that are 8, and I've seen really good boards that are 24. I think you get much more than 24. It's going to be tough. The challenge of having single-digit number of board members is, one, you don't have as many voices representing your constituents, and two, if you want to have an active board, it's going to put a lot of weight on every single member of the board, and some board members may not be ready to do that much. Which gets to the second point, or let me say, and three, if you're missing a single board member, if you only have 8 members of your board, that's a serious problem, right? You're losing 1/8 of your representation, and that becomes difficult. And how many can you effectively staff? How many committees a board can effectively staff? Well, In terms of board staffing of board representation on committees, again, that has to do with the size. If you've got 8 members, having more than 1 or 2 committees is going to be tough. If you've got 24 members, you can have a whole lot of committees. I think one of the challenges at that point is how much staff work needs to go toward each committee. And one of the questions I raised earlier is, I spend all my time preparing for committees and preparing for board meetings, and I can't get the work done. So you need to be careful about what each committee is doing and whether it's directly aligned with the goals of the organization. Next interesting question. Almost conduct their business using email or Google Docs. How comfortable are you with them, with the open meeting law? How transparent is this for the public? How are organizations dealing with it? Well, so there are different levels of questions on this. The questions of, and I have to say, I am not an expert on where the law is on this. For public or entities, for government entities, I think it's very problematic, and that those documents have to be revealed and have to be public unless they're relating to personnel. So that there are various rules about notice of meetings and public availability of meetings. You could do a public meeting on something like this and let the public watch, which could be a really interesting model. I'm not hearing about a whole lot of organizations going fully to Google Docs or something like that in terms of meetings. So people want to post what they're doing. I'll be interested to that. Soon board votes might be able to be made via email. I think they are going to be made via email, and again, I want to distinguish between public organizations, public entities, the zoning commission, school board, whatnot, and 501c3 nonprofit organizations where there is a difference. I think votes by email for the nonprofit organization, I am seeing more of that. I know we occasionally do it between meetings, and I think it's definitely the direction things are going. The Marlborough College, this is not about voting, but they teach their classes half in person and half through social media of one form or another, and they're based on meta research about the most effective way to teach. This is for their graduate school. The most effective way to teach, they find that this combination of in-person and online meetings is the most effective way for people to learn. Now, that's not about public meetings, but I think that the evidence is clear that we are heading that direction toward more online communications. It would be unfortunate if this meant no more face-to-face meetings, because that's where some of the really good relationships can be built and where social capital can be built, but I think a combination is the direction we're going. Mike, keeping in contact with the members for the agenda set from major face-to-face meetings. Okay, this is teachers. Okay, I lost that one here a second. Oh, I see. So this is kind of a similar thing. As a way of keeping in contact with members, I think it's a very good way to stay in contact. I think it would be unfortunate if you started having important votes or made important decisions that way without group discussion in some form or another. But I think as a way of staying in touch, as a way of sharing information, even official documents, and then a good model is share a lot of information and then come back together where we can really talk about it. It can be a way, you probably find this in your own lives, you can have time where you can spend 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there, and if you spend that 10 minutes over time, when you come together for the 2-hour meeting, you're far more prepared for the meeting than if you had done nothing. And so I think it can be a useful way, and particularly with distance, it can be a useful way. In terms of the full meetings, if you've done on telephone meetings, phone call meetings or things like that, it's really hard. So I think you just need to pay attention to those things. Best practices for the term a board member serves and how many terms before rolling off. Well, it seems to me that the best practices that I've been seeing, and I don't know that anybody says here are the official best practices, but 3 or 4 year terms, and 2 of them seems to be a pretty common direction people are going. And I think it's a good idea, and I think it's frequently then people will step off, and if you really want the board member back, you bring them back on again, so you don't have a lifetime cap, but you make sure you force some rotation. What you lose is the long-time memory of the organization, and that is the downside of it. And so I know some boards say, well, we're going to have 1 or 2 seats that are permanent seats, that you can have certain people, the founder of the organization, the founding board member, the great leader in our issue area is going to be on for as long as he or she wants to be on. That's not necessarily a bad idea, although creating different tiers of board members is a little tricky. But I think it's important to rotate board members at some point. If you did 2 3-year terms or 2 4-year terms, 6 or 8 years, that's somebody's in for a long time. The other thing I frequently find is people say, oh no, I want to stay on the board, and the moment they get off, they're relieved because they felt they were getting tired and they didn't quite know they were getting tired. And so it's a way to force freshness in the organization. Somebody might well say, well, shouldn't you force freshness in the staff? That's an interesting question as well, but not the topic of this discussion. That's another webinar. Our board has really latched onto the central desktop tool that we've been using between meetings. It's a pretty user-friendly. We found it to be a great resource. I don't know that resource, and Ray, it'd be useful to just say something else about it. And what do you get out of it? Is it information sharing, or do you actually post votes and things like that? From Bren, there's some discussion about the role of the secretary and treasurer and paid staff. Should the officers be responsible for taking minutes and handling financials, or is it better served by staff? Great question. So first of all, handling financials, the officer, in my view, should be responsible for doing compliance checks and making sure that you've got the kind of controls in your organization that are necessary. So, for instance, if you have checks, contributions, cash, credit card receipts coming into the organization, the best practices are that the person who gets the check should not be the person who deposits the check. You should make sure that at least 2 people are involved in touching it. You want to find embezzlement, find all these stories that have been going on in the state. It's when 1 person touches the money. It's a good story from the middle school my kids went to, where a woman who took the money at the lunch stole $20,000 over 3 years from lunch money because she touched the money and she deposited it and nobody knew that it wasn't showing up. So you need to have more than, so that's the kind of thing that a treasurer, my point is, that's the kind of thing that a treasurer should be monitoring, that your audit committee should be monitoring and saying, okay, here are best practices for making sure we're avoiding embezzlement or whatnot, and I'm going to make sure the staff is behaving in the right way. In terms of the secretary, I think it's entirely appropriate, again, depending on the stage of the organization. If you've got we'll go with a professional level organization that's somewhat fully staffed or staffed enough, it's entirely appropriate to have a staff person write out the minutes, and then they get sent to the secretary who reviews them, edits them, approves them. But I think it's a good thing to do because oftentimes the secretary just won't get around to it. In a smaller organization, if you've got board members who are willing to write up the minutes and send them, I think that's a nice thing too. What do you do when the director of your organization decides, I got a couple questions here. How do you get your board to stay on task, reach consensus, and stick with decisions? They decide on something and then want to call a meeting again the next day because they've changed their minds. Oh, Lordy. And what do you do when the director of your organization decides what his or her role should be regardless of what the job description is? Wow. I don't know, find a new place to work. Well, so it depends on your position in the organization. So one, that has to do with a board chair not doing his or her job. And I would put it on, in the first instance, it's on the board chair's lap, because in the end, the board chair is the person responsible to make sure that the board is hiring the right staff, to make sure that the board is staying on task. So if you're the board chair, you should be able to make that happen and be really clear. When somebody comes back the next day and says, I want to change this, then I say, well, we've already decided this, and be clear about how that works. If you have a board chair who's not there, it kind of depends on where you are in the organization. If you're another board member who is trying to fix this situation, talking to other board members and trying to create some common practices, seeing if you can create a governance committee that will establish procedures and protocols. In the end, getting a new board chair. If you're the staff person trying to make those changes, again, starting with the board chair, if the board chair is not willing to lead, trying to get to a process that will move you toward that, whether it's through a governance committee or an executive committee. When the director decides what the role should be, regardless of the job description, again, you know, a lot of my answers are the same. I mean, that's a board. The board needs to step up. That's a situation I talked earlier about the board unwilling to take on the tough questions. Somebody on the board needs to recognize that things are going the wrong direction. Ray says the software he's talking about is a web-based project management software that allows coordination of meetings, discussion of issues, logging minutes, tracking historical information, and which is great given the frequency of turnover in online votes. Very nice. That's an interesting tool, and I will take a look at that. But the staff board turnover, and you raise a really important point, Ray, the frequency of turnover, having some kind of online tool where people can get the history of the organization is really important. It's also a reason why having good minutes is important, so you can refer back to them. But when you have a big turnover, it can be really hard to maintain a culture of the organization. And sometimes you'll have you want to have a strong culture in the organization, and you'll have a culture keeper, essentially, somebody on the board who takes it as their responsibility to teach new folks how to move an organization forward, how we function, what our role in this organization is. And it can be a really important role, and sometimes it's the chair, sometimes it's just somebody who's been there a long time, but that becomes an important role. Confidentiality, wow, that's a tough one too, and that's a bad one. How do you keep your board members to keep board discussions confidential? You know, come to Jesus discussion. You know, where the board takes it very seriously. I think reminding people, reviewing. So I'm thinking out loud. We do an annual review of our confidentiality policy at our organization. Of course, we're dealing with a lot of very confidential organizations about organizations and what's going well and not well for them, about donors who oftentimes want to be anonymous for reasons that are very good reasons. They may, for instance, be a very big donor in a very small town, and if it became public that they were the one making contributions, it would be problematic for them. So we have an annual discussion at our board about our confidentiality and privacy policies and what they mean, and we do that also with staff. I think putting that as a regular agenda item is potentially a good one to do. Ethics of having a conversation with a key board member or two about constructively correcting the behavior of other board members. Very good idea. I think, first of all, if you have a governance committee, that is entirely and squarely within their purview. Sometimes board members just don't know if they're misbehaving. I can't remember who. Somebody last week was telling me a story about someone who did a really inappropriate thing. And after the board meeting, I think maybe the next day, the board chair called and said, called that person and said, "Oh, thanks for your engagement. So the way you presented that is, you know, I hope you'll think differently about how to do that in the future. It doesn't work within our organizational structure to do that kind of thing." And the board member changed their behavior as a result. And so I think it's entirely appropriate, and in fact, it's the responsibility of the board to have somebody doing that. In a bigger organization, you know, I talked about the culture keeper. Maybe your culture keeper on your board does that. If not, do you have a governance committee or an executive committee, or can your board chair do it? I think it's not, as I say, it's not only okay, but I think it's the right thing to do, because very frequently board members just don't understand that what they're doing would be considered inappropriate, and I think that a most effective board would do that. Okay, I see that we've got the central desktop up. And there are no other questions right now. If anybody has one, post one. I'll just tell one other story. A board member told me, or a staff member told me recently about their organization where the board ended up having secret meetings that she did not know about because they were unhappy about this, that, or the other behavior. And talk about a difficulty, and in her review, nothing was said about it, and she had to call the board chair and say, what's going on? And there were a lot of problems involved with the thing, but that I would view as a situation where the board was not following its own best practices, had not created protocol for how to deal with difficult questions. And it's a board that in the end has to do some work, and she, by her own testament, would say, I have not focused enough on refreshing this board over time, and I need to start paying more attention to how I work with this board over time, because it was a great board, and look how easily it has slipped away from me. Another story, and then I'll let it go and see if there's anything else, or if we can just end this. A problem of a single dominant voice. Sometimes you'll get somebody who is either an expert or is perceived as an expert or thinks they're an expert. And I think one is, if they do have some expertise, it's making sure that somebody else on the board has some complementary expertise if that person's becoming a problem. Two, a strong board chair to ask that person to be a little more responsible in their behavior, or saying it in a nice way. Or three, in the end, if they just won't play nice, at some point you may ask people to leave the board, and that's okay too. Harder to do from a staff level, but it's appropriate for a chair to say, if you have to do it, let's think about a new person. So, anyone else want to get in on anything else? I have another slide up here, by the way, which is some resources. Any of these are good resources. Boardsource, Blue Avocado, you can look these up online. The National Center for Nonprofit Boards, Common Good Vermont, we referenced that up here earlier. That's an online resource for networking nonprofits in the state of Vermont, providing links to a whole lot of resources and trainings in the state, and some of them are online, so those of you out of state could also take advantage of those. And Nonprofit Quarterly is, I just think, a spot-on, excellent resource, in part because they tell you stories. You can get their daily digest of stories about the nonprofit sector, and if you're looking for examples of good board behavior, bad board behavior, reports about things going on in the sector, it's one I look to a lot, and I like just a whole lot. And one of the things I will frequently do is we'll see stories about things that did not work well for organizations, and we'll ask ourselves, could that have happened to us? And that's something we try to avoid. I do see another question. What do you think of staff involvement with board members and board meetings outside of executive and management team staff? I have no problem with that whatsoever. At meetings, I think that so in terms of the board meeting, one challenge you can have with a lot of staff people in is that if you have too many staff people in the meeting, it just gets cluttered and the board gets lost. So that's one. In terms of the outside of meetings, I think the limitation you want to put on it is that board members are not functioning in their board roles with staff other than management. So, for instance, in our organization, a board member may be helping to coordinate an event somewhere in the state, and management team isn't working on that. But a different staff person is working on that. So that's the board member in their volunteer capacity for the organization. That's not the board member in their board board role. And so you need to distinguish those things. And where the board is working on governance, that's with the director and the management team. Where they're working on other things, I think it's entirely appropriate. If you have problems with it, you got some other issues that you need to deal with. How can I deal with a board that is interested in our mission in general but don't know the details of the industry, so they don't know how best to guide the organization's focus? Yeah, very, very common problem, I think, is people care but they don't get what you do. And I think one of the things we try to do is at every meeting have some element that explains our business so the board better understands how we function, and so that over time they become better board members for our particular kind of work. We have a somewhat complicated business model at the community foundations, and we talk about ourselves as being the elephant with the blind men. Everybody knows the community foundation, but one person knows the trunk, one person knows the tusk, one person knows the back leg. And so we try to do education regularly with the board so that they every time get a little bit deeper understanding. Now, what it means is that people can't be their best until a couple of years in, until they've been through a whole cycle of those things. But I think constant education is part of it. And then also framing the questions very clearly and narrowly. What exactly is the question you have that folks can help with? What parameters on a percentage of budget time should be allocated for board training and management? Well, I don't have an answer to that. I think for the executive director or president, I think if you're spending 25% of your time with your board, it's not at all inappropriate. It takes a lot of time. This is the leadership of the organization. This is how you're deciding where you go in the future. I think if you're a small organization, that can be more difficult. And I don't have an easy answer for that. In terms of the board training, I think you need to do enough board training so that people get the organization. I'm a big fan of an initial orientation that's a couple hours that includes staff and board members, and then bring those people back to the orientation the next year too. What we hear is that those people say, I got some of it, and then I had a year on the board, and then I did it again, and other pieces started to fall into place. I would recommend those as activities you can take. Other questions? I think we can. I don't think there's anything else dangling out there. Give anybody else a minute if they have something else they want to do. Well, I guess that's all then from my end. Thank you all for your questions. And the thing I would say is there are a lot of great resources, and every board's going to be a little bit different, and that's okay. So learn from people and then create it to best suit what your organization does. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart.